Three huge controversies have sparked recent debate in and beyond psychology. First is the memory war, over whether traumatic experiences are repressed and can later be recovered with therapeutic benefit. The second great controversy is the gender war, over the extent to which nature and nurture shape our behaviors as men and women. In this unit, we meet the intelligence war. Does each of us have an inborn general mental capacity, intelligence, and can we quantify this capacity as a meaningful number? School boards, courts, and scientists debate the use and fairness of tests that attempt to assess people's mental abilities and assign them a score. Is intelligence testing a constructive way to guide people towards suitable opportunities? Or is it a potent discriminatory weapon camouflaged as science? First, some basic questions. What is intelligence? How can we best assess it? To what extent does it result from heredity rather than environment? What do test score differences among individuals and groups really mean? Should we use such differences to track abilities of public school students, to admit them to colleges or universities, to hire them? This unit offers answers. It will also remind you that there are a variety of mental gifts and that the recipe for high achievement in any field blends talent and grit. Psychologists debate, should we consider intelligence as one aptitude or many? As linked to cognitive speed? As neurologically measurable? Yet, intelligence experts do agree on this. Although people have differing abilities, intelligence is a concept and not a thing. When we refer to someone's IQ, short for intelligence quotient, as if it were a fixed and objectively real trait like height, we commit a reasoning error called reification, viewing an abstract, immaterial concept as if it were a concrete thing. To reify is to invent a concept, give it a name, and then convince ourselves that such a thing objectively exists in the world. When someone says, she has an IQ of 120, they are reifying IQ. They are imagining IQ to be a thing this person has rather than a score she once obtained on a particular intelligence test. Better to say, she scored 120 on the intelligence test. Intelligence is a socially constructed concept. Cultures deem intelligent whatever attributes enable success in those cultures. In the Amazon rainforest, intelligence may be understanding the medicinal qualities of local plants. In an Ontario high school, it may be superior performance on cognitive tasks. In each context, intelligence is the ability to learn from experience, solve problems, and use knowledge to adapt to new situations. In research studies, intelligence is what intelligence tests measure. Historically, as we will see, that has been the sort of problem solving displayed as school smarts. Is intelligence one general ability or several specific abilities? You probably know some people with talents in science, others who excel at the humanities, and still others gifted in athletics, art, music, or dance. You may also know a talented artist who is dumbfounded by the simplest mathematical problems, or a brilliant math student with little aptitude for literary discussion. Are all of these people intelligent? Could you rate their intelligence on a single scale, or would you need several different scales? Charles Spearman, 1863 to 1945, believed we have one general intelligence, often shortened to G. He granted that people often have special abilities that stand out. Spearman had helped develop factor analysis, a statistical procedure that identifies clusters of related items. He had noted that those who score high in one area, such as verbal intelligence, typically score higher than average in other areas, such as spatial or reasoning ability. Spearman believed a common skill set, the G factor, underlies all of our intelligent behavior, from navigating the sea to excelling in school. This idea of a general mental capacity expressed by a single intelligence score was controversial in Spearman's day, and it remains so in our own. One of Spearman's early opponents was L.L. Thurstone. Thurstone gave 56 different tests to people and mathematically identified 7 clusters of primary mental abilities: word fluency, verbal comprehension, spatial ability, perceptual speed, numerical ability, inductive reasoning, and memory. Thurstone did not rank people on a single scale of general aptitude, but when other investigators studied the profiles of the people Thurstone had tested, they detected a persistent tendency. Those who excelled in one of the 7 clusters generally scored well on the others. So, the investigators concluded there is still some evidence of a G factor. We might, then, liken mental abilities to physical abilities. Athleticism is not one thing, but many. The ability to run fast is distinct from the strength needed for powerlifting, which is distinct from the eye-hand coordination required to throw a ball on target. A champion weightlifter rarely has the potential to be a skilled ice skater. Yet, there remains some tendency for good things to come packaged together, for running speed and throwing accuracy to correlate, thanks to general athletic ability. So too, with intelligence. Several distinct abilities tend to cluster together and to correlate enough to define a small general intelligence factor. Satoshi Kanazawa argues that general intelligence evolved as a form of intelligence that helps people solve novel problems. How to stop a fire from spreading, how to find food during a drought, how to reunite with one's band on the other side of a flooded river. More common problems, such as how to mate and how to read a stranger's face, or how to find your way back to camp, require a different sort of intelligence. Kanazawa asserts that general intelligence scores do correlate with the ability to solve various novel problems, like those found in academic and many vocational situations, but do not much correlate with individual skills in evolutionary familiar situations, such as marrying and parenting, forming close friendships, displaying social competence, and navigating without maps. Theories of multiple intelligences. Since the mid-1980s, some psychologists have sought to extend the definition of intelligence beyond Spearman's and Thurstone's academic smarts. They acknowledge that people who score well on one sort of cognitive test have some tendency to score well on another. But maybe this occurs not because they express an underlying general intelligence, but rather because, over time, different abilities interact and feed one another. Rather, as a speedy runner's throwing ability improves after being engaged in sports that develop both running and throwing abilities. Gardner's 8 intelligences. Howard Gardner views intelligence as multiple abilities that come in packages. Gardner finds evidence for this view in studies of people with diminished or exceptional abilities. Brain damage, for example, may destroy one ability but leave others intact. And consider people with savant syndrome, who often score low on intelligence tests but have an island of brilliance. Some have virtually no language ability, yet are able to compute numbers as quickly and accurately as an electronic calculator, or identify almost instantly the day of the week that corresponds to any given date in history, or render incredible works of art or musical performances. About 4 in 5 people with savant syndrome are males, and many also have autism, a developmental disorder. The late memory whiz Kim Peek, a savant who did not have autism, was the inspiration for the movie Rain Man. In 8 to 10 seconds, he could read and remember a page, and he learned 9,000 books, including Shakespeare and the Bible, by heart. He learned maps from the front of phone books, and he could provide MapQuest-like travel directions within any major U.S. city. Yet he could not button his clothes, and he had little capacity for abstract concepts. Asked by his father at a restaurant to lower your voice, he slid lower in his chair to lower his voice box. Asked for Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he responded, 227 Northwest Front Street. But he only stayed there one night. He gave the speech the next day. Using such evidence, Gardner argues that we do not have an intelligence, but rather multiple intelligences. He identified a total of 8, including the verbal and mathematical aptitudes as assessed by standard tests. Thus, the computer programmer, the poet, the street-smart adolescent who becomes a crafty executive, and the basketball team's point guard exhibit different kinds of intelligence. He notes, if a person is strong or weak in telling stories, solving mathematical proofs, navigating around unfamiliar terrain, learning an unfamiliar song, mastering a new game that entails dexterity, understanding others, or understanding himself, one simply does not know whether comparable strengths or weaknesses will be found in other areas. A general intelligence score is therefore like the overall rating of a city, which tells you something but doesn't give you much specific information about its schools, streets, and nightlife. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the world were so just, responds intelligence researcher Sandra Scar. Wouldn't it be nice if being weak in one area would be compensated by genius in some other area? Alas, the world is not just. General intelligence scores predict performance on various complex tasks, in various jobs, and in varied countries. G matters. In two digests of more than 100 datasets, academic intelligence scores that predicted graduate school success also predicted later job success. Even so, success is not a one-ingredient recipe. High intelligence may help you get into a good college and ultimately a desired profession, but it won't make you successful once there. The recipe for success combines talent with grit. Those who become highly successful are also conscientious, well-connected, and doggedly energetic. Anders Ericsson reports a 10-year rule, a common ingredient of expert performance in chess, dancing, sports, computer programming, music, and medicine is about 10 years of intense daily practice. Sternberg's three intelligences. Robert Sternberg agrees that there is more to success than traditional intelligence, and he agrees with Gardner's idea of multiple intelligences, but he proposes a triarchic theory of three, not 8 intelligences. Analytical, academic problem-solving intelligence is assessed by intelligence tests, which present well-defined problems having a single right answer. Such tests predict school grades reasonably well and vocational success more modestly. Creative intelligence is demonstrated in reacting adaptively to novel situations and generating novel ideas. Practical intelligence is required for everyday tasks, which may be ill-defined with multiple solutions. Managerial success, for example, depends less on academic problem-solving skills than on a shrewd ability to manage oneself, one's tasks, and other people. Sternberg and Richard Wagner's test of practical managerial intelligence measures skill at writing effective memos, motivating people, delegating tasks and responsibilities, reading people, and promoting one's own career. Business executives who score relatively high on this test tend to earn high salaries and receive high performance ratings. With support from the U.S. College Board, which administers the Advanced Placement Program as well as the widely used SAT reasoning test to U.S. college and university applicants, Sternberg and a team of collaborators have developed new measures of creativity, such as thinking up a caption for an untitled cartoon, and practical thinking, such as figuring out how to move a large bed up a winding staircase. Their initial data indicate that these more comprehensive assessments improve prediction of American students' first-year college grades, and they do with reduced ethnic group differences. Although Sternberg and Gardner differ on specific points, they agree that multiple abilities can contribute to life success. Neither candidate in the 2000 U.S. presidential election had scored exceptionally high on college entrance aptitude tests. Sternberg noted, yet both became influential. The two theorists also agree that the differing varieties of giftedness add spice to life and challenges for education. Under their influence, many teachers have been trained to appreciate the varieties of ability and to apply multiple intelligence theory in their classrooms. Emotional intelligence. Also distinct from academic intelligence is social intelligence, the know-how involved in comprehending social situations and managing oneself successfully. The concept was first proposed in 1920 by psychologist Edward Thorndike, who noted, "The best mechanic in a factory may fail as a foreman for lack of social intelligence." Like Thorndike, later psychologists have marveled that high-aptitude people are not, by a wide margin, more effective in achieving better marriages, in successfully raising their children, and in achieving better mental and physical well-being. Others have explored the difficulty that some rationally smart people have in processing and managing social information. This idea is especially significant for an aspect of social intelligence that John Mayer, Peter Salovey, and David Caruso have called emotional intelligence. They have developed a test that assesses 4 emotional intelligence components, which are the abilities to 1. Perceive emotions, to recognize them in faces, music, and stories. 2. Understand emotions, to predict them and how they change and blend. 3. Manage emotions, to know how to express them in varied situations. And 4. use emotions to enable adaptive or creative thinking. Mindful of popular misuses of their concept, Mayer, Salovey, and Caruso caution against stretching emotional intelligence to include varied traits such as self-esteem and optimism, although emotionally intelligent people are self-aware. In both the United States and Germany, those scoring high on managing emotions enjoy higher quality interactions with friends. They avoid being hijacked by overwhelming depression, anxiety, or anger. They can read others' emotions and know what to say to soothe a grieving friend, encourage a colleague, and manage a conflict. Such findings may help explain why, across 69 studies in many countries, those scoring high in emotional intelligence also exhibit modestly better job performance. They can delay gratification in pursuit of long-range rewards rather than being overtaken by immediate impulses. Simply said, they are emotionally in tune with others, and thus they often succeed in career, marriage, and parenting situations where academically smarter but emotionally less intelligent people fail. Brain damage reports have provided extreme examples of the results of diminished emotional intelligence in people with high general intelligence. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio told of Elliot, who had a brain tumor removed, "I never saw a tinge of emotion in many hours of conversation with him. No sadness, no impatience, no frustration." Shown disturbing pictures of injured people, destroyed communities, and natural disasters, Elliot showed and realized he felt no emotion. He knew, but he could not feel. Unable to intuitively adjust his behavior in response to others' feelings, Elliot lost his job. He went bankrupt, his marriage collapsed, he remarried and divorced again. At last report, he was dependent on a disability check and custodial care from a sibling. Some scholars, however, are concerned that emotional intelligence stretches the concept of intelligence too far. Multiple intelligence man Howard Gardner welcomes our stretching the concept into the realms of space, music, and information about ourselves and others. But let us also, he says, respect emotional sensitivity, creativity, and emotion as important but different. Stretch intelligence to include everything we prize, and it will lose its meaning. Is intelligence neurologically measurable? Using today's neuroscience tools, might we link differences in people's intelligence test performance to dissimilarities in the heart of smarts, the brain? Might we anticipate a future brain test of intelligence? Brain size and complexity. After the brilliant English poet Lord Byron died in 1824, doctors discovered that his brain was a massive 5 pounds, not the normal 3 pounds. 3 years later, Beethoven died and his brain was found to have exceptionally numerous and deep convolutions. Such observations set brain scientists off studying the brains of other geniuses at their wits' end. Do people with big brains have big smarts? Alas, some geniuses had small brains, and some dim-witted criminals had brains like Byron's. More recent studies that directly measure brain volume using MRI scans do reveal correlations of about plus 0.33 between brain size, adjusted for body size, and intelligence score. Moreover, as adults age, brain size and nonverbal intelligence test scores fall in concert. One review of 37 brain imaging studies revealed associations between intelligence and brain size and activity in specific areas, especially within the frontal and parietal lobes. Sandra Whittleson would not have been surprised. With the brains of 91 Canadians as a comparison base, Whittleson and her colleagues seized an opportunity to study Einstein's brain. Although not notably heavier or larger in total size than the typical Canadian's brain, Einstein's brain was 15% larger in the parietal lobe's lower region, which just happens to be a center for processing mathematical and spatial information. Certain other areas were a tad smaller than average, with different mental functions competing for the brain's real estate. These observations may offer a clue to why Einstein, like some other great physicists such as Richard Feynman and Edward Teller, was slow in learning to talk. If intelligence does modestly correlate with brain size, the cause could be differing genes, nutrition, environmental stimulation, some combination of these, or perhaps something else. Recall from earlier units that experience alters the brain. Rats raised in a stimulating rather than deprived environment develop thicker, heavier cortexes. and learning leaves detectable traces in the brain's neural connections. Intelligence is due to the development of neural connections in response to the environment, notes University of Sydney psychologist Dennis Garlick. Postmodern brain analyses reveal that highly educated people die with more synapses, 17% more in one study, than their less educated counterparts. This does not tell us whether people grow synapses with education, or people with more synapses seek more education, or both. But other evidence suggests that highly intelligent people differ in their neural plasticity, their ability during childhood and adolescence to adapt and grow neural connections in response to their environment. One study repeatedly scanned the brains of 307 children and teens aged 5 to 19. The surprising result? Kids with average intelligence scores showed modest cortex thickening and thinning, with a peak thickness at age 8, suggesting a short development window. The most intelligent 7-year-olds had a thinner brain cortex, which progressively thickened up to age 11 and 13, before thinning with the natural pruning of unused connections. Agile minds came with agile brains. Efforts to link brain structure with cognition continue. One research team, led by psychologist Richard Heyer, correlated intelligence scores from 47 adult volunteers with scans that measured their volume of gray matter, neural cell bodies, and white matter, axons and dendrites, in various brain regions. Higher intelligence scores were linked with more gray matter in areas known to be involved in memory, attention, and language. Brain function. Even in the modest correlations between brain anatomy and intelligence prove reliable, they only begin to explain intelligence differences. Searching for other explanations, neuroscientists are studying the brain's functioning. As people contemplate a variety of questions like those found on intelligence tests, a frontal lobe area just above the outer edge of the eyebrows becomes especially active. In the left brain for verbal questions and on both sides for spatial questions. Information from various brain areas seemed to converge in this spot, suggesting to researcher John Duncan that it may be a global workspace for organizing and coordinating information, and that some people may be blessed with a workplace that functions very, very well. Are more intelligent people literally more quick-witted, much as today's speedier computer chips enable more powerful computing than did their predecessors? On some tasks, they seem to be. Earl Hunt found that verbal intelligence scores are predictable from the speed with which people retrieve information from memory. Those who recognize quickly that sink and wink are different words, or that A and A share the same name, tend to score high in verbal ability. Extremely precocious 12 to 14-year-olds, college students, are especially quick in responding to such tasks. To try to define quick-wittedness, researchers are taking a closer look at speed of perception and speed of neural processing of information. Perceptual speed. Across many studies, the correlation between intelligence score and the speed of taking in perceptual information tends to be about plus 0.3 to plus 0.5. A typical experiment flashes an incomplete stimulus, as in figure 11.3, then a masking image, another image that overrides the lingering after image of the incomplete stimulus. The researcher then asked participants whether the long side appeared on the right or left. How much stimulus inspection time do you think you would need to answer correctly 80% of the time? Perhaps 0.01 second or 0.02 second? Those who perceive very quickly tend to score somewhat higher on intelligence tests, particularly on tests based on perceptual rather than verbal problem solving. Neurological speed. Do the quicker processing and perceptions of highly intelligent people reflect greater neural processing speed? Repeated studies have found that their brainwaves do register a simple stimulus, such as a flash of light or a beep tone, more quickly and with greater complexity. The evoked brain response also tends to be slightly faster when people with high rather than low intelligence scores perform a simple task, such as pushing a button when an X appears on a screen. Neural processing speed on a simple task seems far removed from the untimed responses to complex intelligence test items, such as, in what way are wool and cotton alike? As yet, notes intelligence expert Nathan Brody, we have no firm understanding of why fast reactions on simple tasks should predict intelligence test performance, though he suspects they reflect one's core information processing ability. Philip Vernon has speculated that faster cognitive processing may allow more information to be acquired. Perhaps people who more quickly process information accumulate more information about wool, cotton, and millions of other things. Or perhaps, as one Australian-Dutch research team has found, processing speed and intelligence may correlate not because one causes the other, but because they share an underlying genetic influence. The neurological approach to understanding intelligence, and so many other things in psychology, is currently in its heyday. Will this new research reduce what we now call the G factor to simple measures of underlying brain activity? Or are these efforts totally wrong-headed because what we call intelligence is not a single general trait, but several culturally adaptive skills? The controversies surrounding the nature of intelligence are a long way from resolution. Assessing intelligence. How do we assess intelligence? And what makes a test credible? Answering those questions begins with a look at why psychologists created tests of mental abilities and how they have used those tests. The origins of intelligence testing. Some societies concern themselves with promoting the collective welfare of the family, community, and society. Other societies emphasize individual opportunity. Plato, a pioneer of the individualist tradition, wrote more than 2,000 years ago in The Republic that no two persons are born exactly alike, but each differs from the other in natural endowments, one being suited for one occupation and the other for another. As heirs to Plato's individualism, people in Western societies have pondered how and why individuals differ in mental ability. Western attempts to assess such differences begin in earnest with more than a century ago. The English scientist Francis Galton had a fascination with measuring human traits. When his cousin Charles Darwin proposed that nature selects successful traits through the survival of the fittest, Galton wondered if it might be possible to measure natural ability and to encourage those of high ability to mate with one another. At the 1884 London Exposition, more than 10,000 visitors received his assessment of their intellectual strengths, based on such things as reaction time, sensory acuity, muscular power, and body proportions. But alas, on these measures, eminent adults and high-achieving students did not outscore those supposedly not so bright. Nor did the measures correlate with each other. Although Galton's quest for a simple intelligence measure failed, he gave us some statistical techniques that we still use, as well as the phrase nature and nurture. And his persistent belief in the inheritance of eminence and genius, reflected in the title of his book, Hereditary Genius, illustrates an important lesson from both the history of intelligence research and the history of science. Although science itself strives for objectivity, individual scientists are affected by their own assumptions and attitudes. Alfred Binet, Predicting School Achievement. The modern intelligence testing movement began at the turn of the 20th century, when France passed a law requiring that all children attend school. Some children, including many newcomers to Paris, seemed incapable of benefiting from the regular school curriculum and in need of special classes. But how could the schools objectively identify children with special needs? The French government hesitated to trust teachers' subjective judgments of children's learning potential. Academic slowness might merely reflect inadequate prior education. Also, teachers might prejudge children on the basis of their social backgrounds. To minimize bias, France's Minister of Public Education in 1904 commissioned Alfred Binet and others to study the problem. Binet and his collaborator, Theodore Simon, began by assuming that all children follow the same course of intellectual development, but that some develop more rapidly. On tests, therefore, a dull child should perform as does a typical younger child, and a bright child as does a typical older child. Thus, their goal became measuring each child's mental age, the level of performance typically associated with a certain chronological age. The average 9-year-old, for example, has a mental age of 9. Children with below average intelligence with below average mental ages, such as 9-year-olds who perform at the level of a typical 7-year-old, would struggle with schoolwork considered normal for their age. To measure mental age, Binet and Simon theorized that mental aptitude, like athletic aptitude, is a general capacity that shows up in various ways. After testing a variety of reasoning and problem-solving questions on Binet's 2 daughters and then on bright and backwards Parisian schoolchildren, Binet and Simon identified items that would predict how well French children would handle their schoolwork. Note that Binet and Simon made no assumptions concerning why a particular child was slow, average, or precocious. Binet personally leaned toward an environmental explanation. To raise the capacities of low-scoring children, he recommended mental orthopedics that would train them to develop their attention span and self-discipline. He believed his intelligence test did not measure inborn intelligence as a meter stick measures height. Rather, it had a single practical purpose: to identify French school children needing special attention. Binet hoped his test would be used to improve children's education, but he also feared it would be used to label children and limit their opportunities. Louis Terman, the innate IQ. Binet's fears were realized soon after his death in 1911, when others adapted his tests for use as a numerical measure of inherited intelligence. This began when Stanford University professor Louis Terman found that the Paris-developed questions and age norms were worked poorly with California school children. Adapting some of Binet's original terms, adding others, and establishing new age norms, Terman extended the upper end of the test's range from teenagers to superior adults. He also gave his revision the name it retains today, the Stanford Binet. From such tests, German psychologist William Stern derived the famous intelligence quotient, or IQ. The IQ is simply a person's mental age divided by chronological age and multiplied by 100 to get rid of the decimal point. IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age times 100. Thus, an average child whose mental and chronological ages are the same has an IQ of 100. But an 8-year-old who answers questions as would a typical 10-year-old has an IQ of 125. The original IQ formula worked fairly well for children, but not for adults. Should a 40-year-old who does as well on the test as an average 20-year-old be assigned an IQ of only 50? Most current intelligence tests, including the Stanford Binet, no longer compute an IQ, though the term IQ still lingers in everyday vocabulary as a shorthand expression for intelligence test score. Instead, they represent the test taker's performance relative to the average performance of others the same age. This average performance is arbitrarily assigned a score of 100, and about 2/3 of all test takers fall between 85 and 115. Terman promoted the widespread use of intelligence testing. His motive was to take account of the inequalities of children in original endowment by assessing their vocational fitness. In sympathy with eugenics, a much criticized 19th century movement that proposed measuring human traits and using the results to encourage only smart and fit people to reproduce, Terman envisioned that the use of intelligence tests would ultimately result in curtailing the reproduction of feeble-mindedness in the elimination of an enormous amount of crime, pauperism, and industrial inefficiency. With Terman's help, the U.S. government developed new tests to evaluate both newly arriving immigrants and World War I Army recruits, the world's first mass administration of an intelligence test. To some psychologists, the results indicated the inferiority of people not sharing their Anglo-Saxon heritage. Such findings were part of the cultural climate that led to a 1924 immigration law that reduced Southern and Eastern European immigration quotas to less than a fifth of those for Northern and Western Europe. Binet probably would have been horrified that his test had been adapted and used to draw such conclusions. Indeed, such sweeping judgments did become an embarrassment to most of those who championed testing. Even Terman came to appreciate that test scores reflected not only people's innate mental abilities, but also their education and their familiarity with the culture assumed by the test. Nevertheless, abuses of the early intelligence tests serve to remind us that science can be value-laden. Behind a screen of scientific objectivity, ideology sometimes lurks. Modern tests of mental abilities. By this point in your life, you've faced dozens of ability tests. School tests of basic reading and math skills, course exams, intelligence tests, and driver's license exams, to name just a few. Psychologists classify such tests as either achievement tests, intended to reflect what you have learned, or aptitude tests, intended to predict your ability to learn a new skill. Exams covering what you have learned in this course, like the Advanced Placement Psychology Examination, are achievement tests. A college entrance exam, which seeks to predict your ability to do college work, is an aptitude test, a thinly disguised intelligence test, says Howard Gardner. Indeed, report Meredith Frey and Douglas Detterman, total scores on the U.S. SAT, formerly called the U.S. Scholarship Aptitude Test, correlated plus .82 with general intelligence scores in a national sample of 14 to 21-year-olds. Actually, the differences between achievement and aptitude tests are not so clear-cut. Your achieved vocabulary influences your score on most aptitude tests. Similarly, your aptitudes for learning and test taking influence your grades on achievement tests. Most tests, whether labeled achievement or aptitude, assess both ability and its development. Practically speaking, however, achievement tests assess current performance and aptitude tests predict future performance. Psychologist David Wechsler created what is now the most widely used intelligence test, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WAIS, with a version for school-aged children, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, and another for preschool children. As illustrated in Figure 11.5 on the next page, the WAIS consists of 11 subtests broken into verbal and performance areas. It yields not only an overall intelligence score, as does the Stanford-Binet, but also separate scores for verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, working memory, and processing speed. Striking differences among these scores can provide clues to cognitive strengths or weaknesses that teachers or therapists can build upon. For example, a low verbal comprehension score combined with high scores on other subtests could indicate a reading or language disability. Other comparisons can help a psychologist or psychiatrist establish a rehabilitation plan for a stroke patient. Such uses are possible, of course, only when we can trust the test results. Principles of test construction. To be widely accepted, psychological tests must meet 3 criteria. They must be standardized, reliable, and valid. The Stanford-Binet and Wechsler tests meet these requirements. Standardization. The number of questions you answer correctly on an intelligence test would tell us almost nothing. To evaluate your performance, we need a basis for comparing it with others' performance. To enable meaningful comparisons, test makers first give the test a representative sample of people. When you later take the test following the same procedures, your score can be compared with a sample score to determine your position relative to others. This process of defining meaningful scores relative to a pre-tested group is called standardization. Group members' scores typically are distributed in a bell-shaped pattern that forms the normal curve shown in Figure 11.6. No matter what we measure, heights, weights, or mental aptitudes, people's scores tend to form this roughly symmetrical shape. On an intelligence test, we call the midpoint, the average score, 100. Moving out from the average toward either extreme, we find fewer and fewer people. For both the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler tests, a person's score indicates whether that person's performance fell above or below the average. As Figure 11.6 shows, a performance higher than all, but 2% of all scores earns an intelligence score of 130. A performance lower than 98% of all scores earns an intelligence score of 70. To keep the average score near 100, the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler scales are periodically re-standardized. If you took the WAIS 3rd edition recently, your performance was compared with a standardization sample who took the test during 1996, not to David Wechsler's initial 1930s sample. If you compared the performance of the most recent standardization sample with that of the 1930s sample, do you suppose you would find rising or declining test performance? Amazingly, given that college entrance aptitude tests were dropping during the 1960s and 70s, intelligence performance has been improving. This worldwide phenomenon is called the Flynn effect, in honor of New Zealand researcher James Flynn, who first calculated its magnitude. As figure 11.7 indicates, the average person's intelligence test score 80 years ago was, by today's standard, only a 76. Such rising performance has been observed in 20 countries, from Canada to rural Australia. Although the gains have recently reversed in Scandinavia, the historic increase is now widely accepted as an important phenomenon. The Flynn effect's cause is a mystery. Did it result from greater test sophistication? But the gains began before testing was widespread. Better nutrition? As the nutrition explanation would predict, people have gotten not only smarter, but taller. Moreover, the increases have been greatest at the lowest economic levels, which have gained the most from improved nutrition. Or did the Flynn effect stem from more education, more stimulating environments, less childhood disease, smaller families, and more parental investment? Regardless of what combination of factors explains the rise in intelligence test scores, the phenomenon counters one concern of some hereditarians, that the higher 20th century birth rate among those with lower scores would shove human intelligence scores downward. Seeking to explain the rising scores, and mindful of global mixing, one scholar has even speculated about the influence of a genetic phenomenon comparable to hybrid vigor, which occurs in agriculture when crossbreeding produces corn or livestock superior to the parent plants or animals. Reliability. Knowing where you stand in comparison to a standardization group still won't tell us much about your intelligence unless the test has reliability, unless it yields dependably consistent scores. To check a test's reliability, researchers retest people. They may use the same test, or they may split the test in half and see whether odd question scores and even question scores agree. If the two scores generally agree or correlate, the test is reliable. The higher the correlation between the test-retest or the split half scores, the higher the test reliability. The tests we have considered so far, the Stanford Binet, the WAIS, and the WISC, all have reliabilities of about plus 0.9, which is very high. When retested, people's scores generally match their first score closely. Validity. High reliability does not ensure a test's validity, the extent to which the test actually measures or predicts what it promises. If you use an inaccurate tape measure to measure people's heights, your height report would have high reliability, consistency, but low validity. It is enough for some tests that they have content validity, meaning the test taps the pertinent behavior or criterion. The road test for a driver's license has content validity because it samples the task a driver routinely faces. Course exams have content validity if they assess one's mastery of a representative sample of course material. But we expect intelligence tests to have predictive validity. They should predict the criterion of future performance, and to some extent they do. Are general aptitude tests as predictive as they are reliable? As critics are fond of noting, the answer is plainly no. The predictive power of aptitude tests is fairly strong in the early school years, but later it weakens. Academic aptitude test scores are reasonably good predictors of achievement for children ages 6 to 12, where the correlation between intelligence score and school performance is about plus 0.6. Intelligence scores correlate even more closely with scores on achievement tests, plus 0.81 in one comparison of 70,000 English children's intelligence scores at age 11 to their academic achievement in national exams at age 16. The SAT, used in the United States as a college entrance exam, is less successful in predicting first-year college grades. Here, the correlation is less than plus 0.5. By the time we get to the Graduate Record Examination, GRE, an aptitude test similar to the SAT, but for those applying to graduate school, the correlation with graduate school performance is an even more modest but still significant plus 0.4. Why does the predictive power of aptitude scores diminish as students move up the educational ladder? Consider a parallel situation. Among all American or Canadian football linemen, body weight correlates with success. A 300-pound player tends to overwhelm a 200-pound opponent. But within the narrow 280 to 320-pound range typically found at the professional level, the correlation between height and success becomes negligible. The narrower the range of weights, the lower the predictive power of body weight becomes. If an elite university takes only those students who have very high aptitude scores, those scores cannot possibly predict much. This will be true even if the test has excellent predictive validity with a more diverse sample of students. So, when we validate a test using a wide range of people, but then use it with a restricted range of people, it loses much of its predictive validity. The dynamics of intelligence. We now can address some age-old questions about the dynamics of human intelligence, about its stability over the lifespan, and about the extremes of intelligence. Stability or change. If we retested people periodically throughout their lives, will their intelligence scores be stable? Unit 9 explored the stability of mental abilities in later life. What about the stability of intelligence scores early in life? The developmental researchers have left few stones unturned in their search for indicators of infants' later intelligence. Unable to talk with infants, they have assessed what they can observe, everything from birth weight to the relative lengths of different toes to age of sitting up alone. None of these measures provides any useful prediction of intelligence scores at much later ages. Perhaps, as developmental psychologist Nancy Bailey reflected in 1949, we have not yet found the right tests. Someday, she speculated, we might find infant behaviors which are characteristic of underlying intellectual functions, and which will predict later intelligence. Some studies have found that infants who quickly grow bored with a picture, who, given a choice, prefer to look at a new one, score higher on tests of brain speed and intelligence up to 21 years later, but the prediction is crude. So, new parents who are wondering about their baby's intelligence and anxiously comparing their baby to others can relax. Except for extremely impaired or very precocious children, casual observation and intelligence tests before age 3 only modestly predict children's future aptitudes. For example, children who are early talkers, speaking in sentences typical of 3-year-olds by age 20 months, are not especially likely to be reading by age 4.5. A better predictor of early reading is having parents who have read lots of stories to their child. Remember that even Albert Einstein was slow in learning to talk. By age 4, however, children's performance on intelligence tests begin to predict their adolescent and adult scores. Moreover, high-scoring adolescents tend to have been early readers. One study surveyed the parents of 187 American 7th and 8th graders who had taken a college aptitude test as part of a 7-state talent search and had scored considerably higher than most high school seniors. If their parents' memories can be trusted, more than half of this precocious group of adolescents began reading by age 4, and more than 80% were reading by age 5. Not surprisingly, then, intelligence tests given to 5-year-olds do predict school achievement. After about age 7, intelligence scores, though certainly not fixed, stabilize. Thus, the consistency of scores over time increases with the age of the child. The remarkable stability of aptitude scores by late adolescence is seen in a U.S. Educational Testing Service study of 23,000 students who took the SAT and later took the GRE. On either test, verbal scores correlated only modestly with math scores, revealing that these two aptitudes are distinct. Yet scores on the SAT verbal test correlated plus 0.86 with the scores on the GRE verbal test taken 4 to 5 years later. An equally astonishing plus 0.86 correlation occurred between the two math tests. Given the time lapse and differing educational experiences of these 23,000 students, the stability of their aptitude scores is remarkable. Ian Deary and his colleagues recently set a record for long-term follow-up. Their amazing study was enabled by their country, Scotland, doing something that no nation has done before or since. On Monday morning, June 1st, 1932, essentially every child in the country who had been born in 1921, 87,498 children at ages 10.5 to 11.5, was given an intelligence test. The aim was to identify working-class children who would benefit from further education. 65 years later to the day, Patricia Whaley, the wife of Deary's co-worker, Lawrence Whaley, discovered the test results on dusty storeroom shelves at the Scottish Council for Research and Education, not far from Deary's Edinburgh University office. "This will change our lives," Deary replied when Whaley told him the news. And so it has, with dozens of studies of the stability and the predictive capacity of these early test results. For example, when the intelligence test administered to 11-year-old Scots in 1932 was re-administered to 542 survivors as turn-of-the-millennium 80-year-olds, the correlation between the two sets of scores after some 70 years of varied life experiences was striking. High-scoring 11-year-olds were also more likely to be living independently as 77-year-olds and were less likely to have suffered late-onset Alzheimer's disease. Among girls scoring in the highest 25%, 70% were still alive at age 76, as were only 45% of those scoring in the lowest 25%. World War II prematurely ended the lives of many of the male test takers. Another study that followed 93 nuns confirmed that those exhibiting less verbal ability in essays written when entering their convent in their teens were more at risk for Alzheimer's disease after age 75. Extremes of intelligence. One way to glimpse the validity and significance of any test is to compare people who score at the two extremes of the normal curve. The two groups should differ noticeably, and they do. The low extreme. At one extreme of the normal curve are those whose intelligence test scores fall at 70 or below. To be labeled as having an intellectual disability, formerly referred to as mental retardation, a child must have both a low test score and difficulty adapting to the normal demands of independent living. Only about 1% of the population meets both criteria, with males outnumbering females by 50%. As Table 11.3 indicates, most individuals with intellectual disabilities can, with support, live in mainstream society. Intellectual disabilities sometimes have a known physical cause. Down syndrome, for example, is a disorder of varying severity caused by an extra chromosome 21 in the person's genetic makeup. During the last 2 centuries, the pendulum of opinion about how best to care for Americans with intellectual disabilities has made a complete swing. Until the mid-19th century, they were cared for at home. Many of those with the most severe disabilities died, but people with less significant challenges often found a place in a farm-based society. Then, residential schools for slow learners were established. By the 20th century, many of these institutions had become warehouses, providing residents little attention, no privacy, and no hope. Parents often were told to separate themselves permanently from their impaired child before they became attached. In the last half of the 20th century, the pendulum swung back to normalization, encouraging people to live in their own communities as normally as their functioning permits. Children with mild intellectual disabilities are educated in less restrictive environments, and many are integrated or mainstreamed into regular classrooms. Most grow up with their own families, then move into a protected living arrangement, such as a group home. The hope, and often the reality, is a happier and more dignified life. But think about another reason people diagnosed with mild intellectual disabilities, those just below the 70 score on an intelligence test used to draw the line on who has a disability, might be better able to live independently today than many decades ago. Recall that, thanks to the Flynn effect, the tests have been periodically re-standardized. When that happens, individuals who scored near 70 suddenly lose about 6 IQ points, and 2 people with the same ability level could thus be classified differently depending on when they were tested. As the number of people diagnosed with intellectual disabilities suddenly jumps, more people become eligible for special education and for Social Security payments for those with a mental disability. And in the United States, one of only a few countries with the death penalty, fewer people are eligible for execution. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2002 that the execution of people with intellectual disabilities is cruel and unusual punishment. For people near that score of 70, intelligence testing can be a high-stakes competition. The high extreme. In one famous project begun in 1921, Louis Terman studied more than 1,500 California school children with IQ scores over 135. Contrary to the popular notion that intellectually gifted children are frequently maladjusted because they're in a different world from their non-gifted peers, Terman's high-scoring children, like those in later studies, were healthy, well-adjusted, and unusually successful academically. When restudied over the next 7 decades, most people in Terman's group had attained high levels of education. They included many doctors, lawyers, professors, scientists, and writers, but no Nobel Peace Prize winners. A more recent study of precocious youths who aced the math SAT at age 13 by scoring in the top quarter of 1% of their age group were at age 33 twice as likely to have patents as were those in the bottom quarter of the top 1%. And they were more likely to have earned a PhD, 1 in 3, compared with 1 in 5 from the lower part of the top 1%. Compared with the math aces, 13-year-olds scoring high on verbal aptitudes were more likely to have become humanities professors or written a novel. These whiz kids remind me of John Piaget, who by age 7 was devoting his free time to studying birds, fossils, and machines, who by age 15 was publishing scientific articles on mollusks, and who later went on to become the 20th century's most famous developmental psychologist. Children with extraordinary academic gifts are sometimes more isolated, introverted, and in their own worlds, but most thrive. Is there a gifted education program in your school? There are critics who question many of the assumptions of currently popular gifted child programs, such as the belief that only 3 to 5% of children are gifted and that it pays to identify and to track these special few, segregating them in special classes and giving them academic enrichment, not available to the other 95%. Critics note that tracking by aptitude sometimes creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Those implicitly labeled ungifted may be influenced to become so. Denying lower ability students opportunities for enriched education can widen the achievement gap between ability groups and increase their social isolation from one another. Because minority and low-income youth are often placed in lower academic groups, tracking can also promote segregation and prejudice. Hardly, note critics, a healthy preparation for working and living in a multicultural society. Critics and proponents of gifted education do, however, agree on this. Children have differing gifts. Some are especially good at math, others at verbal reasoning, others at art, still others at social leadership. Educating children as if all were alike is as naive as assuming that giftedness is something, like blue eyes, that you either have or do not have. One need not hang labels on children to affirm their special talents, and to challenge them all at the frontiers of their own ability and understanding. By providing appropriate developmental placement suited to each child's talents, we can promote both equity and excellence for all. Genetic and environmental influences on intelligence. Intelligence runs in families, but why? Are our intellectual abilities mostly inherited, or are they molded by our environment? Few issues arouse such passion or have such serious political implications. Consider, if we mainly inherit our differing mental abilities, and if success reflects those abilities, then people's socioeconomic standing will correspond to their inborn differences. This could lead to those on top believing that their intellectual birthright justifies their social positions. But if mental abilities are primarily nurtured by the environments that raise and inform us, then children from disadvantaged environments can expect to lead disadvantaged lives. In this case, people's standing will result from their unequal opportunities. For now, as best we can, let's set aside such political implications and examine the evidence. Twin and adoption studies. Do people who share the same genes also share comparable mental abilities? As you can see from figure 11.11, which summarizes many studies, the answer is clearly yes. In support of the genetic contribution to intelligence, researchers cite three sets of findings. 1. The intelligence test scores of identical twins reared together are virtually as similar as those of the same person taking the same test twice. The scores of fraternal twins, who typically share only half their genes, are much less similar. Likewise, the test scores of identical twins reared separately are similar enough to have led twin researcher Thomas Bouchard to estimate that about 70% of intelligence test score variation can be attributed to genetic variation. Other estimates range from 50 to 75%. For simple reaction time tasks that take measuring processing speed, estimates range from 30 to 50%. 2. Brain scans reveal that identical twins have very similar gray matter volume, and that their brains, unlike those of fraternal twins, are virtually the same in areas associated with verbal and spatial intelligence. 3. Are there genes for genius? Today's researchers have identified chromosomal regions important to intelligence, and they have pinpointed specific genes that seemingly influence variations in intelligence and learning disabilities. Intelligence seems to be polygenetic, meaning many genes seem to be involved, with each gene accounting for much less than 1% of intelligence variations. But other evidence points to the effects of environment. Studies show that adoption enhances the intelligence scores of mistreated or neglected children. And fraternal twins, who are genetically no more alike than any other siblings, but who are treated more alike because they are the same age, tend to score more alike than other siblings. So if shared environment matters, do children in adoptive families share similar aptitudes? Seeking to disentangle genes and environment, researchers have compared the intelligence test scores of adopted children with those of their adoptive siblings and with those of A, their biological parents, the providers of their genes, and B, their adoptive parents, the providers of their home environment. During childhood, the intelligence test scores of adoptive siblings correlate modestly. Over time, adopted children accumulate experiences in their differing adoptive families. So would you expect the family environment effect to grow with age and the genetic legacy effect to shrink? If you would, behavior geneticists have a surprise for you. Mental similarities between adopted children and their adopted families wane with age, until the correlation approaches zero by adulthood. This is even true of virtual twins, same age, biologically unrelated siblings, reared together from infancy. Genetic influences, not environmental ones, become more apparent as we accumulate life experience. Identical twins' similarities, for example, continue or increase into their 80s. Similarly, adopted children's intelligence scores over time become more like those of their biological parents. Heritability. Recall from Unit 3C the meaning of heritability. As noted earlier, estimates of the heritability of intelligence, the variation in intelligence test scores attributable to genetic factors, put it about 50%. Does this mean your genes are responsible for 50% of your intelligence and your environment for the rest? No. It means we credit heredity with 50% of the variation in intelligence among people being studied. This point is so often misunderstood that I repeat, heritability never pertains to an individual, only to why people differ from one another. Heritability differences among people due to genes can vary from study to study. Where environments vary widely, as they do among children of less educated parents, environmental differences are more predictive of intelligence scores. Recall from Unit 3C Mark Twain's fantasy of raising boys in barrels to age 12, feeding them through a hole. Given the boys' equal environments, differences in their individual intelligence test scores at age 12 could be explained only by their heredity. Thus, heritability for their differences would be nearly 100%. But if we raise people with similar heredities in drastically different environments, barrels versus advantaged homes, the environment effect will be huge, and heritability will therefore be lower. In a world of clones, heritability would be zero. Remember, too, that genes and environment work together. If you try out for a basketball team and are just slightly taller and quicker than others, notes James Flynn, you will more likely be picked, play more, and get more coaching. The same would be true for your separated identical twin, who might, not just for genetic reasons, also come to excel at basketball. Likewise, if you have a natural aptitude for academics, you will more likely stay in school, read books, and ask questions, all of which will amplify your cognitive brain power. Thanks to such gene-environment interaction, modest genetic advantages can be socially multiplied into big performance advantages. Environmental influences. Genes make a difference. Even if we were all raised in the same intellectually stimulating environment, we would have differing aptitudes. But life experiences also matter. Human environments are rarely as impoverished as the dark and barren cages inhabited by deprived rats that develop thinner than normal brain cortexes. Yet, severe deprivation does leave footprints on the brain. Early environmental influences. We have seen that biology and experience intertwine. Nowhere is this more apparent than in impoverished human environments, such as J. McVicker Hunt observed in a destitute Iranian orphanage. The typical child Hunt observed there could not sit up unassisted at age 2 or walk at age 4. The little care the children received was not in response to their crying, cooing, or other behaviors, so the children developed little sense of personal control over their environment. They were instead becoming passive glum lumps. Extreme deprivation was bludgeoning native intelligence. Aware of both the dramatic effects of early experiences and the impact of early intervention, Hunt began a program of tutored human enrichment. He trained caregivers to play language-fostering games with 11 infants, imitating the baby's babbling, then engaging them in vocal follow-the-leader, and finally teaching them sounds from the Persian language. The results were dramatic. By 22 months of age, the infants could name more than 50 objects and body parts, and so charmed visitors that most were adopted. An unprecedented success from the orphanage. Institutionalized Romanian orphans also have benefited cognitively if transferred early to more enriched home care. Hunt's findings are an extreme case of a more general finding. Among the poor, environmental conditions can override genetic differences, depressing cognitive development. Unlike children of affluence, siblings within impoverished families have more similar intelligence scores. Schools with lots of poverty-level children often have less qualified teachers, as one study of 1,450 Virginia schools found. And even after controlling for poverty, having less qualified teachers predicted lower achievement scores. Malnutrition also plays a role. Relieve infant malnutrition with nutritional supplements, and poverty's effect on physical and cognitive development lessens. Do studies of such early interventions indicate that providing an enriched environment can give your child a superior intellect, as some popular books claim? Most experts are doubtful. Although malnutrition, sensory deprivation, and social isolation can retard normal brain development, there is no environmental recipe for fast-forwarding a normal infant into a genius. All babies should have normal exposure to sights, sounds, and speech. Beyond that, Sandra Scar's verdict still is widely shared. Parents who are very concerned about providing special educational lessons for their babies are wasting their time. Still, explorations of intelligence promotion continue. One widely publicized but now discounted finding, dubbed the Mozart effect, suggested that listening to classical music boosted cognitive ability. Other research has, however, revealed small but enduring cognitive benefits to either keyboard or vocal music training. The music training effect appears unexplained by the greater parental income and education of music-trained children. It may result from improved attention focus or abstract thinking ability. Other researchers hold out hope that targeted training of specific abilities, rather like a bodybuilder doing curls to strengthen biceps and sit-ups to strengthen abdominal muscles, might build mental muscles. Schooling and intelligence. Later in childhood, schooling is one intervention that pays dividends reflected in intelligence scores. Schooling and intelligence interact, and both enhance later income. Hunt was a strong believer in the ability of education to boost children's chance for success by developing their cognitive and social skills. Indeed, his 1961 book, Intelligence and Experience, helped launch Project Head Start in 1965. Head Start, a U.S. government-funded preschool program, serves more than 900,000 children, most of whom come from families below the poverty level. Does it succeed? Researchers study Head Start and other preschool programs, such as Sure Start in Britain, by comparing children who experience the program with their counterparts who don't. Quality programs offering individual attention increase children's school readiness, which decreases the likelihood of repeating a grade or being placed in special education. Generally, the aptitude benefits dissipate over time, reminding us that life experience after Head Start matters too. Psychologist Edward Ziegler, the program's first director, nevertheless believes that there are long-term benefits. High-quality preschool programs can provide at least a small boost to emotional intelligence, creating better attitudes towards learning and reducing school dropouts and criminality. Genes and experience together weave the intelligence fabric, but what we accomplish with our intelligence depends also on our own beliefs and motivation, reports Carol Dweck. Those who believe that intelligence is biologically fixed and unchanging tend to focus on proving and defending their identity. Those who instead believe that intelligence is changeable will focus more on learning and growing. Seeing that it pays to have a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset, Dweck has developed interventions that effectively teach early teens that the brain is like a muscle that grows stronger with use as neuron connections grow. Indeed, as we noted earlier, superior achievements in fields from sports to science to music arise from disciplined effort and sustained practice. Group differences in intelligence test scores. If there were no group differences in aptitude scores, psychologists could politely debate hereditary and environmental influences in their ivory towers. But there are group differences. What are they? And what shall we make of them? Gender similarities and differences. In science, as in everyday life, differences, not similarities, excite interest. Compared with the anatomical and physiological similarities between men and women, our differences are relatively minor. Yet, it is the differences we find exciting. Similarly, in psychological domain, gender similarities vastly outnumber gender differences. We are all so much alike. In that 1932 testing of all Scottish 11-year-olds, for example, girls' average intelligence score was 100.6 and boys was 100.5. On a 2001 to 2003 cognitive ability test administered to 324,000 British 11 and 12-year-olds, boys averaged 99.1 and girls a similar 99.9. So far as G is concerned, boys and girls, men and women, are the same species. Yet, most people find differences more newsworthy, and here they are. Spelling. Females are better spellers. At the end of high school, only 30% of U.S. males spell better than the average female. Verbal ability. Females excel at verbal fluency and remembering words. And, year after year, among nearly 200,000 students taking Germany's test for medical studies, young women have surpassed men in remembering facts from short medical cases. My wife, who remembers many of my experiences for me, tells me that if she died, I'd be a man without a past. Non-verbal memory. Females have an edge in remembering and locating objects. In studies of more than 100,000 American adolescents, girls also modestly surpass boys in memory for picture associations. Sensation. Females are more sensitive to touch, taste, and odor. Emotion detecting ability. Females are better emotion detectors. Robert Rosenthal and their colleagues discovered this while studying sensitivity to emotional cues, an aspect of normal intelligence. They showed hundreds of people brief film clips of portions of a person's emotionally expressive face or body, sometimes with a garbled voice added. For example, after showing a 2-second scene revealing only the face of an upset woman, the researchers asked people to guess whether the woman was criticizing someone for being late or was talking about her divorce. Rosenthal and Hall found that some people, many of them women, are much better emotion detectors than others. Such skills may explain women's somewhat greater responsiveness in both positive and negative emotional situations. Could this ability also have helped our ancestral mothers read emotions in their infants and would-be lovers, in turn fueling cultural tendencies to encourage women's empathetic skills? Some evolutionary psychologists believe so. Math and spatial aptitudes. On math tests given to more than 3 million representatively sampled people in 100 independent studies, males and females obtain nearly identical average scores. But again, despite greater diversity within the genders than between them, group differences make the news. In 20 of 21 countries, females displayed an edge in math computation, but males scored higher in math problem solving. In Western countries, virtually all math prodigies participating in the International Mathematics Olympics have been males. More female math prodigies have, however, reached the top levels in non-Western countries, such as China. The score differences are sharpest at the extremes. Among 12 to 14-year-olds scoring extremely high on SAT math, boys have outnumbered girls 13 to 1, and within that precocious group, the boys more often went on to earn a degree in the inorganic studies and engineering. In the United States, males also have an edge in the annual physics and computer science advanced placement exams. Men are 99% of the world's chess grandmasters, a difference attributable to the much greater number of boys beginning to play competitive chess. Understanding why boys more than girls enter competitive chess is a challenge for future research. The average male edge seems most reliable in spatial ability tests like the one shown in Figure 11.13, which involves speedily rotating three-dimensional objects in one's mind. Exposure to high levels of male sex hormones during the prenatal period does not enhance spatial abilities. So, one recent experiment indicates, does action video game playing. Spatial ability skills help when fitting suitcases into a car trunk, playing chess, or doing certain types of geometry problems. From an evolutionary perspective, those same skills helped our ancestral fathers track prey and make their way home. The survival of our ancestral mothers may have benefited more from a keen memory for the location of edible plants, a legacy that lives today in women's superior memory for objects and their location. Evolutionary psychologist Steven Pinker argues that biological as well as social influences appear to affect gender differences in life priorities, women's greater interest in people versus men's in money and things, and risk-taking, with men more reckless, and in math reasoning and spatial abilities. Such differences are, he notes, observed across cultures, stable over time, influenced by prenatal hormones, and observed in genetic boys raised as girls. Other researchers are exploring a brain basis for male-female cognitive differences. Elizabeth Spelk, however, urges caution in charting male-female intellectual worlds. It oversimplifies to say that women have more verbal ability and men have more math ability. Women excel at verbal fluency, men at verbal analogies. Women excel at rapid math calculations, men at rapid math reasoning. Women excel at remembering objects, spatial positions, men at remembering geometric layouts. Other critics urge us to remember that social expectations and divergent opportunities shape boys' and girls' interests and abilities. Gender-equal cultures, such as Sweden and Iceland, exhibit little of the gender math gap found in gender unequal countries, such as Turkey and Korea. In the United States, the male edge in math problem solving is detectable only after elementary school. Traditionally, math and science have been considered masculine subjects, But as more parents encourage their daughters to develop their abilities in math and science, the gender gap is narrowing. In some fields, including psychology, women now are in most of the PhDs. Yet, notes Diane Halpern, with a twinkle in her eye, no one has asked if men have the innate ability to succeed in those academic disciplines where they are underrepresented. Greater male variability. Finally, intelligence research consistently reports a peculiar tendency for males' mental ability scores to vary more than females. Thus, boys outnumber girls at both the low extreme and the high extreme. Boys are, therefore, more often found in special education classes. They talk later, they stutter more. Ethnic similarities and differences. Fueling the group differences debate are two other disturbing but agreed upon facts. 1. Racial groups differ in their average intelligence test scores. 2. High-scoring people and groups are more likely to attain high levels of education and income. A statement by 52 intelligence researchers explained, the bell curve for whites is centered roughly around IQ 100, the bell curve for American blacks roughly around 85, and those for different subgroups of Hispanics roughly midway between those for whites and blacks. Comparable results come from other academic aptitude tests. In recent years, the black-white difference has diminished somewhat, and among children has dropped to 10 points in some studies. Yet the test score gap stubbornly persists, and other studies suggest the gap stopped narrowing among those born after 1970. There are differences among other groups as well. New Zealanders of European descent outscore native Maori New Zealanders. Israeli Jews outscore Israeli Arabs. Most Japanese outscore the stigmatized Japanese minority, the Burakumin. And those who can hear outscore those born deaf. Everyone further agrees that such group differences provide little basis for judging individuals. Women outlive men by 6 years, but knowing someone's sex doesn't tell us with any precision how long that person will live. Even Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein, whose writings drew attention to black-white differences, reminded us that millions of black have higher IQs than the average white. Swedes and Bantus differ in complexion and language. The first factor is genetic, the second environmental. So what about intelligence scores? As we have seen, heredity contributes to individual differences in intelligence. Does that mean it also contributes to group differences? Some psychologists believe it does, perhaps because of the world's differing climates and survival challenges. But we have also seen that group differences in a heritable trait may be entirely environmental, as in our earlier barrel versus home-reared boys example. Consider one of nature's experiments. Allow some children to grow up hearing their culture's dominant language, while others, born deaf, do not. Then give both groups an intelligence test rooted in the dominant language, and, no surprise, those with expertise in that language will score highest. Although individual performance differences may be substantially genetic, the group difference is not. Also consider, if each identical twin were exactly as tall as his or her co-twin, heritability would be 100%. Imagine that we then separated some young twins and gave only half of them a nutritious diet, and that the well-nourished twins all grew to be exactly 3 inches taller than their counterparts. An environmental effect comparable to that actually observed in both Britain and America, where adolescents are several inches taller than their counterparts were a half-century ago. What would the heritability of height now be for our well-nourished twins? Still 100%, because the variation in height within the group would remain entirely predictable from the heights of their malnourished identical siblings. So even perfect heritability within groups would not eliminate the possibility of a strong environmental impact on the group differences. Might the racial gap be similarly environmental? Consider. Genetics research reveals that under the skin, the races are remarkably alike. Individual differences within a race are much greater than differences between races. The average genetic difference between two Icelandic villagers or between two Kenyans greatly exceeds the group difference between Icelanders and Kenyans. Moreover, looks can deceive. Light-skinned Europeans and dark-skinned Africans are genetically closer than are dark-skinned Africans and dark-skinned Aboriginal Australians. Race is not a neatly defined biological category. Some scholars argue that there is a reality to race, noting that there are genetic markers for race, the continent of one's ancestry, and that medical risks, such as skin cancer or high blood pressure, vary by race. Behavioral traits may also vary by race. No runner of Asian or European descent, a majority of the world's population, has broken 10 seconds in the 100-meter dash, but dozens of runners of West African descent have done so, observes psychologist David Rowe. Many social scientists, though, see race primarily as a social construction without well-defined physical boundaries. People with varying ancestry may categorize themselves in the same race. Moreover, with increasingly mixed ancestries, more and more people defy neat racial categorization. Asian students outperform North American students on math achievement and aptitude tests. But this difference appears to be a recent phenomenon and may reflect conscientiousness more than competence. Asian students also attend school 30% more days per year and spend much more time in and out of school studying math. The intelligence test performance of today's better fed, better educated, and more test prepared population exceeds that of the 1930s population, by the same margins that the intelligence test score of the average white today exceeds that of the average black. No one attributes the generational group differences to genetics. White and black infants have scored equally well on an infant intelligence measure, preference for looking at novel stimuli, a crude predictor of future intelligence scores. When blacks and whites have or receive the same pertinent knowledge, they exhibit similar information processing skill. The data support the view that cultural differences in the provision of information may account for racial differences in IQ. Report researchers Joseph Fagan and Cynthia Holland. In different eras, different ethnic groups have experienced golden ages, periods of remarkable achievement. 2,500 years ago, it was the Greeks and the Egyptians, then the Romans. In the 8th and 9th centuries, genius seemed to reside in the Arab world. 500 years ago, it was the Aztec Indians and the peoples of Northern Europe. Today, people marvel at Asians' technological genius. Cultures rise and fall over centuries. Genes do not. That fact makes it difficult to attribute a natural superiority to any race. Moreover, consider the striking results of a national study that looked back over the mental test performances of white and black young children after graduation from college. From 8th grade through the early high school years, the average aptitude scores of the white students increased, while those of the black students decreased, creating a gap that reached its widest point at about the time that high school students like you take college admission tests. But during college, the black students' scores increased more than 4 times as much as those of their white counterparts, thus greatly decreasing the aptitude gap. It is not surprising, concluded researcher Joel Meyerson and his colleagues, that as black and white students complete more grades in high school environments that differ in quality, the gap in cognitive test scores widens. At the college level, however, where black and white students are exposed to educational environments of comparable quality, many blacks are able to make remarkable gains, closing the gap in test scores. The question of bias. If one assumes that race is a meaningful concept, the debate over race differences in intelligence divides the 3 camps. Note Earl Hunt and Jerry Carlson. 1. There are genetically disposed race differences in intelligence. 2. There are socially influenced race differences in intelligence. 3. There are race differences in test scores, but the tests are inappropriate or biased. Are intelligence tests biased? The answer depends on which of 2 very different definitions of bias are used, and on an understanding of stereotypes. Two meanings of bias. A test may be considered biased if it detects not only innate differences in intelligence, but also performance differences caused by cultural experiences. This, in fact, happened to Eastern European immigrants in the early 1900s. Lacking the experience to answer questions about their new culture, many were classified as feeble-minded. David Weschler, who entered the United States as a 6-year-old Romanian just before this group, designed the WAIS. In this popular sense, intelligence tests are biased. They measure your developed abilities, which reflect, in part, your education and experiences. You may have read examples of intelligence test items that make middle-class assumptions, for example, that a cup goes with a saucer, or, as in one of the sample test items from the WAIS, that people buy insurance to protect the values of their homes and possessions. Do such good items bias the test against those who do not use saucers or do not have enough possessions to make the cost of insurance relevant? Could such questions explain racial differences in test performance? If so, are tests a vehicle for discrimination, consigning potentially capable children to dead-end classes and jobs? Defenders of aptitude testing note that racial group differences are at least as great as nonverbal items, such as counting digits backwards. Moreover, they add, blaming the test for a group's lower scores is like blaming a messenger for bad news. Why blame the tests for exposing unequal experiences and opportunities? If, because of malnutrition, people were to suffer stunted growth, would you blame the measuring stick that reveals it? If unequal past experiences predict unequal future achievements, a valid aptitude test will detect such inequalities. The second meaning of bias, its scientific meaning, is different. It hinges on a test's validity, on whether it predicts future behavior only for some groups of test takers. For example, if the US SAT accurately predicted the college achievement of women but not that of men, then the test would be biased. If this statistical meaning of the term, the near consensus among psychologists, as summarized by the U.S. National Research Council's Committee on Ability Testing and the American Psychological Association's Task Force on Intelligence, is that the major U.S. aptitude tests are not biased. The test's predictive validity is roughly the same for women and men, for blacks and whites, and for rich and poor. If an intelligence test score of 95 predicts slightly below average grades, that rough prediction usually applies equally to both genders and all ethnic and economic groups. Test takers' expectations. Throughout this text, we have seen that our expectations and attitudes can influence our perceptions and behaviors. Once again, we find this effect in intelligence testing. When Stephen Spencer and his colleagues gave a difficult math test to equally capable men and women did not perform as well as men, except when they had been led to expect that women usually do as well as men on the test. Otherwise, the women apparently felt apprehensive, and it affected their performance. With Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, Spencer also observed this self-fulfilling stereotype threat when black students taking verbal aptitude tests under conditions designed to make them feel threatened performed at a lower level. Critics note that stereotype threat does not fully account for the black-white aptitude score difference. But it does help explain why blacks have scored higher when tested by blacks than when tested by whites. And it gives us insight into why women who have scored higher on math tests when no male test takers were in the group, and why women's chess play drops sharply when they think they are playing a male rather than female opponent. Steele concluded that telling students they probably won't succeed, as is sometimes implied by remedial minority support programs, functions as a stereotype that can erode test and school performance. Over time, such students may detach their self-esteem from academics and look for recognition elsewhere. Indeed, as African American boys progress from 8th to 12th grade, they tend to underachieve as the disconnect between their grades and their self-esteem becomes pronounced. One experiment randomly assigned some African American 7th graders to write for 15 minutes about their most important values. That simple exercise in self-affirmation had the apparent effect of boosting their semester grade point average by 0.26 in a first experiment and 0.34 in a replication. Minority students in university programs that challenge them to believe in their potential or to focus on the idea that intelligence is malleable and not fixed have likewise produced markedly higher grades and had lower dropout rates. What then can we realistically conclude about aptitude tests and biased? The tests do seem biased, appropriately so, some would say, in one sense, sensitivity to performance differences caused by cultural experience. But they are not biased in the scientific sense of making valid statistical predictions for different groups. Bottom line, are the tests discriminatory? Again, the answer can be yes or no. In one sense, yes. Their purpose is to discriminate, to distinguish among individuals. In another sense, no. Their purpose is to reduce discrimination by reducing reliance on subjective criteria for school and job placement. Who you know, what school you're from, or whether you are the right kind of person. Civil service aptitude tests, for example, were devised to discriminate more fairly and objectively by reducing the political, racial, and ethnic discrimination that preceded their use. Banning aptitude tests would lead those who decide on jobs and admissions to rely more on other considerations, such as personal opinions. Perhaps, then, our goals for tests of mental abilities should be threefold. First, we should realize the benefits Alfred Binet foresaw, to enable schools to recognize who might profit most from early intervention. Second, we must remain alert to Binet's fear that intelligence test scores may be misinterpreted as literal measures of a person's worth and potential. And finally, we must remember that the competence that general intelligence tests and sample is important. It helps enable success in some life paths, but it reflects only one aspect of personal incompetence. Our practical intelligence and emotional intelligence matter, too, as do other forms of creativity, talent, and character. The carpenter's spatial ability differs from the programmer's logical ability, which differs from the poet's verbal ability. Because there are many ways of being successful, our differences are variations of human adaptability.